Thank you, and it's a particular pleasure and an honor to be here because so much of my dissertation research was I pursued in Gotha, and I had the pleasure of working with the early collections um, uh, in Gotha before Zeitzen. Um, so I'll begin. So I'd like to start with a manuscript, today found in the Forschungsbibliothek Gotha, which reputed to have something that I think it's fair to say few manuscripts here or anywhere else possess: the power to summon the forces of nature to the will and command of its reader. At least, this is what's suggested in a curious Dutch inscription added by a 17th century owner. The inscription tells a tale of a battle at the high seas. So I'll read the inscription. I received this book as a present from the Honorable Mr. Peterson, captain of the ship Horn, as he was returning home from Ceylon in pursuit of an Arab and Mughal pirate ship. He was fortunate and overtook it around Madagascar, and on boarding the ship, he tore this book from the hands of an Arab priest, or mullah, just as he was occupied with conjuring a new, speedy wind with the wind bird in its pages, and a magical Mughal letter and other spells, such that, though they tried to vain to flee, the priest went down with the whole ship and crew. And indeed, if we open the manuscript itself, we find the very magical wind bird mentioned in its pages. Of course, this is plainly an absurd forgery, one that might be more convincing if the manuscript itself did not consist in no small part of Turkish poetry. But like many forgeries, it tells us something about those who created it and their intended marks. The flyleaf note recounts a manuscript history. It tells how the object was once in the hands of someone in a distant land for whom it had a distinct meaning and significance, and how it was taken by force to be brought to where it is now. In doing so, it rips a page from a novel of high adventure, appealing to one's sense of the exotic while laying a trail of easily verified details. There's also an odd echo of truth to the story, one that I think any 17th century German would be at least dimly aware of. While I suspect the manuscript never magically conjured a wind, its poems once rang in the ears of those who could read them, and while it probably wasn't ripped directly from anyone's hands, the book did once have a place in the lives of its readers, and indeed, it's not unlikely that it was torn from those lives in a moment of violence. I say this because Central Europe, at that very moment, was awash in stolen manuscripts. Hundreds and hundreds of Islamic manuscripts written in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, looted from Ottoman Europe by invading armies. Of course, I can't say for certain that this was one of them. But what I'd like to show in the next 40 or so minutes is the character, scope, and importance of these so-called Türkenbeute manuscripts. This was a profound and very unsettling moment of cultural encounter, one very different than the adventure on the high seas told in the Dutch inscription we just read. And it was also, I'd like to suggest, a formative moment in scholarship, when elements of the cultural geography of European Orientalism first emerged. So in what follows, I'll begin with a sort of brief overview of the earlier history of Türkenbeute, and then discuss in more detail a moment of particular significance in the years after 1683, when the largest portion of Türkenbeute manuscripts were looted, and then end with a few general observations on why the subject is important. The various conflicts that flared up between the Ottoman Empire and other European powers over the 16th and 17th centuries brought an irregular stream of Islamic manuscripts to Western European libraries and scholars. Indeed, some of them quite important for scholarship. You already heard a few weeks ago from Laura Henriksen about manuscripts looted from Tunis in the 1530s, and we could easily trace the history of armed conflict on the flyleaves of manuscripts. For instance, the primary manuscript that the Dutch orientalist Jacob Golius used to study the Golestan in the late 1630s and early 1640s, is a really astonishing manuscript full of the notes and glosses of an earlier Ottoman scholar, had been found 70 years earlier in an abandoned fortress in Hungary. Another rather interesting example is an absolutely beautiful, really stunning Paris Quran, with an endowment note related to the then recent Ottoman conquest of the Hungarian city of Győr, a city that was then soon lost, at which point the Quran was probably looted and made its way into a Paris collection by the mid-17th century. We're also brought expertise directly to scholars, and we find cases where educated Ottoman prisoners worked directly with Orientalists. and where we can reconstruct, at least in part, these collaborations from extant manuscripts and contemporary correspondence. I would really urge everybody to read the recent work of Julia Celik and Chiara Petrolini on the Vienna librarian Sebastian Tenknagel, who was a sort of pioneering orientalist at the beginning of the 17th century, and who worked in particular extensively with an Ottoman captive named Ibrahim Dervish. We've long known about this captive from a classic essay by Claudio Hermer, but Julia really went in and just worked through all of the manuscripts and shows, in detail how this collaboration worked in practice. We know a bit less about another prisoner named Hussein of Buda, though he was no less important. Hussein had been probably taken prisoner from around the same time, and he worked for scholars in Italy and France. And we find a number of manuscripts in his hand in the BNF in Paris. And this is a Danistan glossary, sort of a common Turkish-Persian glossary that he copied for the Savary de Brève. And he seems to have played, in particular, an important role in the transformation of Orientalist scholarship in France in the early 17th century, though there's still quite a bit to learn about him in his Orientalist context. These are just a few examples, but I think they already point to a key observation. It wasn't just the movement of material that defined the impact of Türkenbeute, but also of people, and as well the coordination between the different stations of Orientalist scholarship. And I think the examples of Hussein of Buda and Dervish Ibrahim, or Ibrahim Dervish, show the way in which this process was accelerating over the course of the early 17th century. That is to say, people were bringing manuscripts directly from the front lines to scholars. And then those scholars were making use of the opportunities from prisoners in order to do new kinds of scholarship. Tenknagel is a really great example. He sits down with a Persian-Turkish dictionary and then tries to come up with Latin glosses through some form of communication with his scribe. So this earlier moment of Türkenbeute and the work of scribes like Hussein and Ibrahim played an important role in the shift also that I see as the formative impulse, and really the formative impulse in the development of modern Oriental studies. That is, the turn among Orientalists toward the combined study of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, and the mining of the largely Ottoman or Ottoman-mediated Islamic philological tradition. This starts slowly around 1600, but it's going full steam around 1630s, by the 1630s and 40s, when scholars realized, so in the case of the Golistan, for instance, that to edit a translated Persian text, you need to find Turkish and Arabic commentaries, or to write an Arabic-Latin dictionary, you need to find and understand Arabic-Turkish and Arabic-Persian dictionaries. And I've been going through all many of you are probably familiar with the lexicon of Arabic-Latin lexicon of Golius, and I've been going through Golius's manuscripts, and they're full of Turkish or Arabic-Turkish dictionaries that are sometimes interleaved, that are often full of notes, and where we see Golius trying to understand Arabic through sometimes a quite rudimentary study of Turkish or Persian. So one place that this dynamic played out is in the context of trade and diplomacy. So we see cities like Aleppo, Cairo, and in particular Istanbul become important spaces of new scholarship, where Orientalists learned from Muslim and Eastern Christian scholars, and where they collected manuscripts that eventually formed the basis of major collections in places like Oxford, Leiden, and Paris. So that is to say, a kind of manuscript route opened up between the Eastern Mediterranean and select places in Western Europe. And this then, it developed and intensified over time. So we see the first generations of traveling Islamic manuscript hunters like Golius and Rabius around the 1620s and 30s, increasingly sophisticated state projects of manuscript collection, thinking particularly of the French, and as well as the institutionalization of Turkish and Arabic instruction as states taught to train diplomatic interpreters. So acquisition in this case was more selective. Scholars, for instance, sometimes sent out wish lists or sought out certain texts. And it also cultivated a small group of intermediaries, informants, scribes, and helpers. So people who went out to find and purchase manuscripts, scholars who were paid to help copy and read them, hojas who taught scholars abroad. And we know a great deal about this world now, in no small part because of its proximity to the state. which made it both well documented and well preserved. And so you can just you can learn an enormous amount just moving back and forth between the BNF and the French diplomatic archives, or between the Haushof and Staatsarchiv in Vienna and the Austrian National Library. So to return then to the subject of the talk, the sheer number and variety of looted Ottoman manuscripts that we see from the 16th through the 18th century, as well as the instances of close scholarly coordination that we find, suggests that Türkenbeute constituted a second, comparably important manuscript route for Orientalists. One that, however, functioned quite differently, not consistent and regular over time, but irregular, occurring in moments of extraordinary violence, often at the ends of prolonged sieges, and exhibiting an entirely different pattern of circulation. So remember that the 17th century, think of the 17th century Orientalists in Istanbul assembling a small library of manuscripts through a variety of intermediaries and then shipping it all back to a particular library or institution in Western Europe. This was basically localized and selective. In contrast, Türkenbeute sometimes involved the immediate dispersal of major collections into dozens of different hands, and these manuscripts appear to have circulated quite widely and were invested with value that reflected their status as looted objects, as trophies of war. And these manuscripts were then only consolidated gradually over time into scholarly libraries, and then from scholarly libraries into major institutions. Türkenbeute manuscripts also moved with a likely quite enormous mass of other objects. So we have a really quite astonishing 18th century description of a small Türkenbeute collection, which lists, along with a miniature Qur'an, just kind of listing some items from this long description, a banner with a gilded silver button and a silk red, yellow, and violet blue wrapping, the marriage contract of a pasha. We have a prayer book, a seal made of carnelian with Arabic writing, a Turkish rosary made of amber, an inlaid knife, a coffee pot with a gilded lid, a wooden spoon with ivory, and so on. Türkenbeute shifted, so that's to say, whenever we think of these manuscripts, we should think of it in the context of this just massive material. And of course, you can see much of it in, for instance, in Dresden. You have instances of textiles, which were quite prized, as well as weapons and armor. So this Türkenbeute shifted the geography of Orientalist scholarship. Collections of looted manuscripts formed in places like Dresden, Leipzig, and Bologna, far from the earlier centers of advanced Orientalist studies. So we're not in Leiden anymore. And you don't necessarily have to send people to Leiden anymore to learn to work with Islamic manuscripts. And in this case, Leipzig in particular became an important center of Orientalist study. So while we do find a not insignificant number of looted manuscripts in the 16th and early 17th century, most Türkenbeute manuscripts likely arrived later, over a relatively small span of time, a period of a few decades at the turn of the 18th century, and most notably in the years immediately after the 1683 Ottoman siege of Vienna. Vienna plays still today a central role in how we understand Türkenbeute and sort of the story of discovering the encampment. And it's a very good story. It's a heroic victory followed by an encounter where the Ottoman army is forced to retreat, followed by an encounter with exotic objects in the massive encampment that the Ottomans abandoned in their hurried retreat. And there are certainly a number of manuscripts there. So we do find contemporary inscriptions that identify books as coming from the Ottoman encampment. However, this is a very sanitized vision of looting. It's a walk through a kind of Ottoman ghost town where everything is free for the taking. And it's far from the circumstances in which most Türkenbeute was probably looted. And indeed, in some ways, far from how those objects were imagined at the time. In short, and this is my argument, most Türkenbeute was acquired in moments of incredible violence, sometimes after prolonged sieges, not in the abandoned encampment outside Vienna, but by victorious armies storming conquered cities and fortresses of Ottoman Europe in the years that followed the Ottoman retreat from Vienna. So Neuhäusel in 1685, Buda in 1686, and Belgrade in 1688 in particular. And indeed, the violence that entailed was discussed openly, was part of the kind of fetishization of the objects. So I'd like to highlight one particularly well-documented example. Buda was conquered in 1683 on the second attempt after a earlier failed siege and after months of besieging it in 1686, during which time the city had suffered all manner of disease and deprivation. Those who survived were greeted with something much worse. Contemporary accounts describe the massacres that followed victory. After breaching its walls, armies shot surrendering soldiers, killed and raped Buda's inhabitants, and massacred the Jews of the city, at least those who did not barricade themselves in the synagogue, in which case they managed to negotiate their safe passage. The accounts tell of streets strewn with eviscerated bodies, people whose stomachs had been torn open in search for swallowed valuables, and they also tell of wide-scale looting. And there's a really startling firsthand account of precisely this looting that gives you the perspective of being a looter. You're just sort of running around and trying to grab something. You can only get what you can carry, and if you find something too valuable, someone else is liable to take it from you. Among these accounts, we find several that describe specifically the looting of manuscripts. So, for instance, a letter now in Copenhagen, written from London to Louis Pic, the librarian of the Bibliothèque Mazarine in Paris, and an important hub in the Republic of Orientalist Letters, mentions the appearance of English and Scottish soldiers with books from Buda, relaying details about their origin. In particular, the correspondent gives the crucial detail. There were 2 libraries that were completely dispersed by looters. One of these libraries is easily identified from the inscriptions found in multiple manuscripts, both notes written by looters themselves and earlier Ottoman inscriptions marking the manuscripts as part of a specific endowment. Indeed, many manuscripts belong to one single endowment, that of Sheikh Suleiman Effendi. As you can see here, the endowment is marked on pasted titles found on the covers of many, though not all of the manuscripts, as well as inscriptions on their flyleaves, which specify not only the endowment, but its location, the Büyük Cami, or the Grand Mosque of Buda. The Grand Mosque was a reminder of Buda's pre-Ottoman history. It was indeed converted from an earlier church that was then converted back into a church, as well as the history of the Ottoman conquest of Buda more than a century before, which was fresh in the minds of many at the time, who might have heard rumors of wondrous signs that foretold the city's imminent reconquest, and who knew that Buda Castle had once itself housed an extraordinary library, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, which the Ottomans had themselves allowed to be looted and dispersed. The Suleiman Effendi manuscripts are particularly notable for how common they are, and they become in turn a kind of metric for the dispersal of these manuscripts. And here's just to kind of give another example from Dresden. You can see they're quite easy to identify, and the endowment inscription is very prominent. But they're also found in Jena, you find them in Hamburg, you find them as far as Glasgow. And I've found at least, or identified at least a few manuscripts that were looted from Buda, or with inscriptions saying so, in Paris. Among these manuscripts, we also find several that give the details of the looting. So these accounts refer to a man identified as a Grand Mufti, or the Pontiff, and presumably someone of considerable status who was lying executed among the manuscripts. And indeed, manuscripts inscriptions emphasize the proximity to this very violence. One which we've already discussed mentions that the manuscript, is the one right here, came from under the corpse of the Mufti, and suggests that it's sprayed with blood. Yet another stages an even more elaborate scene. It's a quite extensive, longer Latin translation that deserves to be quoted at some length, because it describes this individual who identifies as being clearly calls it a Turkish pontiff, and identifies as having been executed, describes him like a second Archimedes, as if buried among his countless books and manuscripts, torn and strewn about by the uncultivated soldiers. It was apparent from his features that he was a man of venerable learning and a combination of courtesy and dignity. And this is a powerful moment of recognition of a common humanity. But behind the classical comparison, I think, is a basic and quite interesting ambivalence, one that at times borders on a certain fetishization. The proximity of intense violence is what lends this object its value. It also lends it authenticity. It embeds it deeper within a historical moment. And if I can make a small digression, such depictions of violence during the Turkish wars, and Buda in particular, would make a quite fascinating case study. It's notable how frank discussions are and accounts are of the time of the massacres that happened there. They're discussed in detail, and they're not sugar-coated. It also is notable that items such as coins and tapestries commemorated this looting. There's one in particular, there's a coin that has a chronogram that says that, the warm spilled Turk's blood cools this oven's glow. And it's often, it's a word play on often. It's the name for Buddha, but also for the word oven. A much later example shows how this kind of grisly detail and sometimes rather complex feelings towards it were woven into legends about Türkenbeute objects. Qur'an, now in Halle, contains an 18th century inscription that recounts a story about the book that during the last Turkish war, it had been in the hands of a Turkish prisoner who refused to part with it as long as his head was on his body, at which point his head was cut off. It's, of course, a very shocking story. It describes a kind of martyrdom, a martyrdom without a miracle. And the inscription ends with the observation that the manuscript itself, like the Gotha manuscript that we saw, has been splashed with the blood of the man, or seems to have been, of the man who died for his beliefs. That is to say that this object is a kind of relic. And I think that there's a lot going on here, and it's a very complex reckoning with violence. There's a respect for this kind of martyrdom, but there's also a sense that it's somehow different. To return then to Buddha and to the second Archimedes, this learned man lying dead among the manuscripts of Buddha's Grand Mosque. He's mentioned in yet another source, in a description by the Italian Luigi Marsili, who had participated in the siege of Buddha as an engineer, and who had worked quickly to secure a significant portion of the manuscripts in the Grand Mosque. Those manuscripts are now in Bologna, and a number of them have been digitized, so you can view them online. And I haven't been to Bologna, but I'd be curious to see how many come from the Suleiman Effendi Waqf. I haven't been able to find any that do. So among the digitized manuscripts, which is notable. That then brings us back to the question of the letter from Peak. So there were supposedly two libraries in Buda. What was then the second library? One possibility is that it refers to two separate libraries housed in the Grand Mosque. That is to say that, for instance, the Suleiman Effendi manuscripts were housed differently. Though I find this not as likely. More likely, I think, is that the second library was the library of the nearby Mustafa Pasha Madrasa. Since I found two manuscripts, one in Berlin and one in Hamburg, that were endowed there. And I think it's fair to say that the scene is probably much like the one at the Grand Mosque. So there's a kind of free-for-all for looting, and that seems to be what the Peak's correspondent is suggesting. I'd also like to suggest that this is a characteristic of Türkenbeute as a whole. It's been suggested that Türkenbeute was, or sometimes it's suggested that it's sort of taken from dead soldiers, and the material and the subject, it is simply not consistent with that. And it seems more likely that what the manuscripts that we can identify as Türkenbeute manuscripts, as certain or likely Türkenbeute manuscripts, were likely dispersed from major collections. And that what we're really seeing is the transfer of manuscript material from major Ottoman European collections, particularly in Buda, Belgrade, and Neuhäusel, and into wide circulation in Central Europe. And it's worth noting that these manuscripts also appeared, as in the earlier quote, alongside a mass of other objects, textiles and metalworks, but as well alongside a great number of enslaved Turks who they are sort of appear on the record when they're baptized, but must have been more numerous than that. And indeed, the first thing these manuscripts tell us, if we care to listen, is about the world they were ripped from. And one sometimes finds personal notes that are deeply moving in view of their proximity to impending tragedy. This is one example where a proud parent has taken up a pen and written a note in a rather nice Quranic manuscript to commemorate the birth of a son, Hassan. Reading this, one's impulse is to calculate how old Hassan would have been when the world he was born into collapsed, and this book was looted from his home. If I'm remembering, it was around 11 or 12. Another set of inscriptions speak to the complex paths Türkenbeute manuscripts took after their looting. In some cases, their circulation began almost immediately. We find evidence of manuscripts changing hands soon after looting, being distributed, or making their way up the chain of command. Someone presents a particularly nice manuscript to their superior officer, and so on. One very interesting example is this copy of Abu Suud's Tafsir. It's a kind of major Ottoman Quranic commentary. It's a quite beautiful manuscript. Fittingly, the manuscript was presented to the Saxon elector, appears to have been, with a full leather slipcase and a note by the Orientalist August Pfeiffer, which explains what the manuscript is and gives a sense of its value. And I also found in the State Archives in Dresden some discussion of Pfeiffer about the value of this manuscript that emphasized its script and how well it was written. And I think that manuscripts like this pose a very interesting question, which is how many hands did this manuscript have to go through to make it to this point? And it's likely that it was taken at some point by a soldier. This soldier was presented to somebody else, and an officer, et cetera, et cetera. Türkenbeute manuscripts also circulated as gifts within German society. One interesting example is this copy of a section of a Turkish Quran commentary given by a Meissen notable, Matthias Zimmermann, to his beloved daughter. I also suspect that a significant number of Türkenbeute manuscripts moved west with merchants. So that is to say that what we would think of or could identify as Türkenbeute didn't necessarily come with soldiers. And the theory here being that basically there's a sort of collapse of Ottoman society, and there's all these objects that are left behind, they're sort of slowly draining out through merchants. I've only found, however, one instance where someone mentioned buying manuscripts from foreign merchants, so it's quite intriguing. The Breslau orientalist Andreas Akulutus noted here that he purchased a collection of surahs and prayers from Greek merchants in Vienna in 1687. So I think, however, I think this was more common, and I suspect that some of the later manuscripts that we see that have prices where the price is noted, these are manuscripts that might have sort of passed from Hungary into German lands in any number of different ways. Though, of course, this is rather speculative. Akulutus himself is perhaps our best informant about the circulation of Türkenbeute because he was so diligent in documenting on the flyleaves of his manuscripts where and how he acquired them. These notes paint a portrait of a considerable private collection assembled gradually through an enormous variety of contexts and places. Friends gifted him manuscripts. He acquired others on his travels, and at moments we catch glimpses of the world these manuscripts moved in. There's one, if I remember correctly, where he remarks that it was supposed to have been used by a dwarf acrobat to ward off evil. Some sort of rumor that goes along with the manuscript. My favorite, though, is this one, where he notes that the manuscript was given to him by somebody who visited his study, but did not wish to give his name. And I think this is a telling detail. This idea that in Breslau in 1687, one could be visited by a mysterious stranger who drops in and gives you an Islamic manuscript. Akulutus also demonstrates the shift in German Oriental studies brought on by this new material. We have a considerable number of manuscripts that come from his earlier studies before the arrival of Türkenbeute manuscripts. There's a quite fascinating group of manuscripts now found in Dresden that Akulutus produced as a student of August Pfeiffer, and that show him working through the polyglot assortment of printed works available to 17th century Orientalists. So he writes a kind of grammar for everything. There's even a Chinese grammar, actually. At this time, we also find a marked interest or focus on biblical philology. Through his encounter with Türkenbeute, however, Akulutus turned to the study of the Quran. He assembled a remarkable collection of dozens of Quran manuscripts, including a Turkish interlinear Quran translation that had belonged to the great Turkologist Babinski, as well as a Quran that was looted from a mosque in Indonesia. He also undertook, though never completed, a very ambitious project, the production of an Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Latin polyglot Quran. In changing the focus of his scholarship, Akulutus was responding to the possibilities of new Türkenbeute material, but he was also responding to the demands of others. Remember, this is a world awash in novel objects, and people were bringing those objects to Akulutus to decipher and explain. So we find a lot of work around this time with coins, for instance. We also find Akulutus teaching a young orientalist, Sigismund Zabish, who had inspired to study Turkish, Persian, and Arabic to read the manuscripts that his father had acquired just around this time, immediately after Buda. Zabish actually goes on to be one of the great 18th century cranky German librarians. He was a very capable orientalist in his own right, left a great number of manuscripts in Dresden. But I also think he represents a real watershed moment, because he's the first orientalist, at least that I can think of, who trained as a student in Germany to work specifically with Islamic manuscripts. There's a wonderful set of notes in Zabish's hand from his study trip to Paris, which he undertook as a young 20-something. Particularly, it seems to look at Quranic material, probably for Akulutus or in connection with Akulutus's project. And what the notes show is just how well prepared he is to do this kind of research abroad. He's a good graduate student, so to speak. He was able to copy manuscripts, identify interesting material, gain trust and support from hard-to-impress scholars in Paris, like Louis Pic, and navigate the mass of Islamic manuscripts in Parisian libraries. The consolidation of Türkenbeute into scholarly collections, however, only happened over time. And so the general timeline of this is that there's Pfeiffer has a significant, Akulutus's teacher has a significant collection. Akulutus has a significant collection. There's also Wagenseil. Most of this is Türkenbeute, and Zabish has a rather large collection. I'm guessing at around 50 manuscripts, and Akulutus, Wagenseil, and Pfeiffer's manuscripts are purchased by or acquired by the Ratsbibliothek in Leipzig, and they become the basis of the Leipzig's collection today. There's a wonderful, Boris Lieberens wrote a wonderful book about the subject, and the Zabish manuscripts are now in Dresden, as well as another collection from Moritz Weidemann. So this sort of pieces, these sort of major collections are pieced together over time, these institutional collections. There's also, however, a considerable corpus of inscriptions that show the ownership of Türkenbeute manuscripts by people who could not read them, and who kept them as trophies of war or exotic keepsakes. So a kind of interesting thing, always interesting question that you encounter in these manuscripts is, where are the bibliographic inscriptions? Are they upside down on the last page, which happens often enough, where somebody identifies it as a Turkish book or something like that? And that suggests that even this kind of basic question of orientation is unfamiliar to them. We also find a quite interesting phenomenon in scholars or in individuals using Islamic manuscripts and Türkenbeute manuscripts as places to store information. And so this is a very interesting, I believe this might be Shemi's Golestan commentary. It's a Golestan commentary of some sort that's in Dresden. And the flyleaves are full of notes. Some of them are references to Islam and the Turks. And you find things like, this kind of, you see up top here, die Türken glauben nicht an Vater, Sohn und Geist. Was glauben Türken dann, was niemand lobt und preist? And so it's a kind of, it's a sort of bit of verse that he picked up somewhere. There's an even more intriguing example of this in a group of Quran sections that are now in Hamburg and are from Neuhäusel, and were sent from a soldier there to a small town pastor in, I think, the south of Germany. It's Bittelbrunn or Bittelbrunn or something of that. I've sort of identified a few small towns that could be, but it doesn't seem to be a place of considerable size. And this individual, very interestingly, used the flyleaves as spaces to record news and rumors from the East. And so this about the marriage of a child with Dragamon. There's another one I'm not showing here that's about, if I'm remembering this correctly, it's the lightning striking the grave of Muhammad as a kind of wondrous sign, and these kinds of details. So there's a process of selection going on here. This is a kind of prized object, and it's used to record certain kinds of information. Owners also decorated manuscripts in quite interesting ways. So one example which is still kind of a mystery to me, is this quite gorgeous slipcase of leather and decorative paper made for a ledger of for a small Ottoman administrative district in Europe. I'd love to know why it was made, but I find it quite striking. I mean, because you sort of see a lot of these ledgers when you're going through manuscript material, and this one really got the royal treatment, and it's a good indication, I think, of how looted material was prized, even if it wasn't necessarily understood. This is written in a kind of the very difficult script called EuQu, and I doubt that even if they knew some Turkish, that they would be able to decipher that. The sudden market for Türkenbeute also created opportunities for forgers and cheats. One very interesting example is this odd collection of bound fragments now in Dresden. And this is rather speculative, but what I think happened here is from Weidemann's collection, I believe. And it's a sort of small Frankenstein book, and you can see one of them was, even one of the pages was even sewn back together. That is constructed in an odd way, and you can see the binding looks and feels more like a European imitation of Islamic binding. And there's also elements such as the mounting of paper using wax that's rather unusual. And my guess is that this is somebody who basically took some random fragments and put them together into something that looks more like a book in order to sell it. Another, and I think much more egregious example is this Qur'an, which once belonged to Abraham Hinkelmann. So he was famous for his edition of the Arabic Qur'an, 1694, and who used a number of different manuscripts, some of which was Türkenbeute. And this one is particularly notable, and it's become rather famous because it contains the ownership inscription of one of the most famous learned women of the 17th century, Anna Maria von Schoormann. And what's notable, and what Brockelmann already noted in his catalog of Hamburg's manuscript, is that the inscription has been pasted on, probably was cut out from another book, and notably it's dated 1623, but there's an endowment inscription that postdates it by several decades. So it's just extremely unlikely that this is anything but a Türkenbeute manuscript that has been done up to increase its value with a inscription from another library. So let me see, stop the sharing. I'd like to then conclude by reflecting a bit on the historical significance of Türkenbeute. And in particular, I'd like to make three arguments. The first is that Türkenbeute is part of the story of 17th century. The 17th century was a formative moment in Orientalist scholarship. And I think that the theory of the colonial origins of European Oriental studies still persists. And it persists as a kind of zombie idea, one that lives on despite regular refutation. And I think that scholars have shown that whatever the benchmark, be it the emergence of specialized scholarship, the conscious recovery of literary traditions, whatever it is, the modern Orientalist philology starts not with William Jones around 1800, but probably in places like Leiden and Oxford in the 1630s and 40s. That seems to be the most likely case. And I think what we see here is that there's a kind of second, and here's my second argument or point, that there's a kind of second theater of European Orientalism that opens up that's very, very distinct from the kind of Oriental studies that we see emerging at the major universities in Western Europe, in places like Paris and Leiden, where there are direct links with diplomatic communities in places like Istanbul. But nonetheless, one that is of considerable significance. That is to say, scholars like Sebisch, who are trained within the context of this sort of Türkenbeute Oriental studies, actually go on to contribute in interesting and important ways to Oriental studies and to study and work and do research in places like Leiden and Paris. And then a final point, I think that there's an open question, it's a very interesting one, about the role of Türkenbeute in the formation of German Oriental studies in particular as a kind of formative moment. I'd sort of, I think maybe perhaps a bit provocatively sort of called the Sebisch the first student of Islamic manuscripts, a German student of Islamic manuscripts. But it's very notable that just in terms of numbers, there were an extraordinary number of people who were studying Oriental studies, sort of a more Hebrew and Arabic inflected Oriental studies in German lands in the 17th century. And yet advanced research was primarily done in places like Leiden and Oxford. And so there's a steady stream of German scholars who are coming to Leiden in the 1630s and 40s, and then often from Leiden and sort of on to Istanbul. Rabius, Gentius, and Warner are the most prominent, but also Elichmann, Deusing, to name a number of them. And with Türkenbeute, that seems to change. And I think that Zabish is really the kind of benchmark there. But an even better example would be Reiske. And Reiske is somebody who's really remarkable when you look at his manuscripts, many of which we have the privilege of being able to see in Copenhagen, where his Nachlass is. Because when Reiske goes to Leiden, he really is a better Arabist than his teacher. And he's able to do that because he's getting manuscripts from Hamburg. He has manuscripts that he can work with in Leipzig, even if there's a relatively small collection of Arabic material. And there's also a tradition that goes back to other German scholars like Kerr of doing serious work with the manuscripts. So on that, I'll end, and thank you.